Welcome to The Point of View. We have a special show for you tonight. It's your favorite current affairs program on television, and it's an interactive conversation. We get the right guests, we ask them relevant questions on issues that matter to you. My name is Bernard Avle. Now, if you're watching the show and want to contribute to the discussion, there's a WhatsApp number we put on the screen, and we'll be happy for you to contribute. If you're watching on social media as well, there's a stream that goes down that you can contribute to. When we come back, I'll tell you what tonight's show is about. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Point of View. So today we have a two-part show for you. In the second part of the show, I will be sitting down with a very phenomenal woman who is a politician and a diplomat. She's a baroness. She has done politics, she's done diplomacy, and she's done international relief work. She's Baroness Valerie Amos. She came to Ghana on the invitation of Mount Grace University on some educational things she does for them and the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. So I sat down with her and we spoke about Brexit, we spoke about aid, Africa's development, we spoke about the year of return, and we also spoke about the Scramble for Africa. But that's part two of the conversation I'll be having tonight. For the first part, I'm your guest because I will be walking you through what I consider a very interesting development we're seeing in global geopolitics and where that leaves Ghana and other African countries. In a sense, that conversation is a segue into my conversation with Baroness Amos because it tells the true story of Africa and paints in a stark manner the challenges we face as a country in our development. So I'm going to start by telling you a story. The story began 150 years ago in the year 1884. It was actually the month of November. 14 world powers sat down to divide a plot of land. That plot of land happens to be Africa. Now look on the screen carefully. These were the world powers in the we call it the 19th century because it's 1884, called the Berlin Conference. All the countries painted in blue were taken by France, which was one of the world powers at the time. So from Burkina Faso to Senegal to Mauritania to Morocco and Algeria, all you see in blue were annexed by France. Then look at the pink or pinkish colored countries. Ghana in there, Nigeria. A lot of them are in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. The British took over those countries. Germany took only 3 or 4 countries. Tanzania, which is in the green. Southwest Africa, which is known as Namibia, Togo, which is between Ghana and Benin Republic, and Cameroon, a part of Cameroon, which later became French. And of course, the Spaniards, they weren't that interested in Africa because strategically they were well positioned in South America. So apart from Equatorial Guinea and Western Sahara, Spain didn't really play much in Africa. And then, of course, there was Congo, the yellow painted large country in the middle. Italy tried to annex a few countries. So if you look up north, there's green for Italy, trying to take over Libya and then Somalia. Italy had a war with Ethiopia. Ethiopia and Liberia are the only 2 countries on this map who were not properly colonized. The Ethiopians did not surrender. In a sense, that's why we love Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the headquarters of the AU. They tell us that Africa can resist the struggle against other powers. So this is the world in 1884, November. Now, the countries that were ruling, that were powerful in those years, I will show you those countries. So we had Germany, led by Otto von Bismarck. Of course, Belgium, although it's very small, was quite influential. There was Spain, there was Denmark, there's Austria, Italy, UK, France. US was there. But US, we'll talk about US later. They were not very interested in direct annexation because they themselves had been colonized by the British. And interestingly, the US needed France to help them in their independence war. So a colonized country would not really want to recolonize. So even though US was at that conference, represented by a very interesting gentleman. In fact, two men, John Carson and Henry Sanford. The Americans didn't take part actively in the scramble. They would emerge later on. So those were the countries that took part in this scramble. I'll come back to this map later. But let me now tell you a story of decades, where now every 10 years, world economic power changes. Now, the reason I'm linking economics to where we are in Africa politically is that almost everything you see politically has an economic background. So, for example, in the year 1981, the world was an industrial base where countries that were strong industrially ruled, the United States of America, Japan, Germany, they've always been industrial giants. But look at the two characters on the right. Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, chemist turned politician, Ronald Reagan. Now, these two people introduced something we call neoliberal economics. What did neoliberalism do? It was a new idea about how to run an economy. Even though that particular policy rejuvenated Britain as a nation, this was largely at the expense of industrial development. So a lot of places in UK lost their industrial base. So if you go to places like Sheffield, Newcastle, in the northern part of England, they vote Labour. They don't like Margaret Thatcher because Margaret Thatcher's policies broke the unions, destroyed industry. But that wasn't the full story. What Margaret Thatcher succeeded in doing was to shift Britain from an industrial economy to a service-led economy. Britain became a country that depended on its export of financial services. So London became the center of world finance. Britain is the world's largest exporter of finance. They export more finance than America, than Hong Kong, than China, than anybody else. So with every shift in economic policy, there are winners and losers. And we will explain why parts of the North voted for Brexit. A lot of them still reeling from the economic policies of Thatcher and Reagan. They were the neoliberals. But neoliberalism also introduced a certain type of thinking for African countries, which has led to weak industries, a lot of service focus, and a weak capital base for most African countries, with Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and IMF promoting that kind of thinking. So if you look at the world GDP, as the map shows, you have US, and then of course you have Japan, then there's Germany. UK doesn't do that well. But let's go 10 years ahead. Things begin to change gradually. UK is establishing itself as a financial powerhouse. The key characters in this are George Bush 1. And I'm using the decades deliberately because this was the Gulf War. This is George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. And of course, Kiichi Miyazawa. Japan was still an economic powerhouse because a lot of the collapse in the British industry went to Japan. So in a sense, as China is the world's factory today, Japan was the world's factory in the 90s. And look at the difference between the growth rate of Japan and China. Very interesting. So China was not even showing in these pictures until very, very late on. So I'm looking at 1991. Where is China? They are not even in the top 10. US is number 1, 6,000, you can call it 6,000 billion, so like 6 trillion USD as their GDP. Japan follows, Germany follows, France, Italy. China is not even in the top 10 of world economic powers. This is just 1991. China is not in the top 10. Let's move a decade ahead. 2001. What are we seeing? Things begin to change. This is just a decade where China was not in the top 10, where US, Japan, and Germany were ruling. Look at the red line in the middle. That's China. That's 1.2 trillion. Still, US is in a big lead, 10 trillion. Japan is about half of US. Germany is third. UK is fourth. So UK jumps from 6th to 4th because now its service, technology, financial-led economy is bearing fruit. But now the factory of the world is shifting from Japan to China. So look at China. GDP higher than Italy, higher than Canada. And of course, this was the infamous alliance that led to the so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, a war that many people thought was unconscionable. 10 years down the line, what are we seeing? Now, in 2001, China was about 1/4 of Japan in terms of GDP. Because as I will show you, China had 1.2 trillion. Japan had 4.7. But look at 2011. China has $6.8 trillion of GDP. That's higher than Japan now because the factory of the world is moving to China. UK goes down. US is still in a comfortable lead, right? So now the two lead figures in the world, Barack Obama, father born in Kenya, himself born in Kansas. And who's the man standing next to him? That's Hu Jintao. That's the Chinese Prime Minister, Hu Jintao. So the world is changing. Every decade something changes, right? We didn't have any serious war in 2011, although the world financial crisis in 2008 led to a lot of problems. Barack Obama had to save the big three auto companies. Now jump 6 years ahead. US has $19 trillion in GDP. China has more than doubled, 11 trillion. Japan is half of China. Germany, UK in that order. But look at India. Now I'm showing you these things because in looking at the scramble for Africa, there's a relationship between powerful countries and how they see this continent and what they do with it, right? So just as I showed you earlier, the big 12 countries that divided the continent in 1884, now you're seeing a new economic order. US is number 1, China is number 2, Japan is number 3. Look at Germany, constantly number 4, because Germany has always been export-led industrialization. They've always promoted their polytechnics. German technicians are brilliant. They have Audi, they have Mercedes, they have BMW, they have Volkswagen. Did you know that Germans did Neoplan? Our Neoplan company that we thought was collapsing, which has almost received a death sentence. Neoplan was started by Germans in Saxony, right? So there you have Donald Trump and his friend Xi Jinping. They've been engaging in a trade war. And mind you, the trade war is not necessarily just about goods. It's also about technology. Because for us in the 70s, the world was about industrialization and factories, and then financial services 2 decades later. Now it's services, but it's not just that. It's also technology. So Huawei, Apple, the top 10 companies today are not manufacturing companies. Facebook, Google, Apple, Alibaba, they're all in technology. So there you have it. China competing with the US, but US is still in a comfortable lead. But let me show you now today, which are the top 10 countries in the world today and what is the size of their GDP. US, $21 trillion in number 1. China, 15 trillion. Don't forget, 20 years ago, China was around 1 trillion. In 2 decades, look at where they are. They are now a strong number 2. Japan is now 1/3 of China because China is now competing on 2 levels. They are both the factory of the world, that's the manufacture, but they are also advancing in technology. And that would explain what China wants to do in Africa. China is looking for not just raw materials, but also markets. Now, in the 1884 map I showed you, these 12 countries were looking for 3 things. They needed new places to invest their surpluses. They needed raw materials like copper, cotton, rubber. Of course, they needed slaves as well, human labor, right? But China is both a manufacturing powerhouse. That means they need markets. But China also needs a strong relationship with African countries to build infrastructure because it also needs places to invest its money. So now in the world, you have US, China, Japan, Germany, India, France. Now, what does all this mean? So as I said, in the previous map, 150 years ago, it was about raw materials. It was also about strategic locations. So if you look at that map again, the British were in the south and the east. Why? Because of New Zealand, because of Malaysia, because of India, because of Australia. British needed ports. They needed access routes to their economic bases in the east. And therefore, they chose east and southern. Now, these things are important for you to understand when we go for conferences abroad, what the Western world wants and what our leaders should be asking for. Let me now take you to what I call the new scramble for Africa. You will notice that the 2020 map of the world, in terms of the countries that are courting Africa's attention, it correlates directly with the top 10 countries in the world in terms of economic base. So you see Africa surrounded by France. That's your top left. There's India, there's US, there's UK on the right, there's Japan in there, Germany is still there. There's even Russia, and there's China. What are they looking for? Let's start with China. China has held successful conferences called the FOCAC. First one, 2015, 2018. Out of 54 African countries, only Eswatini did not attend that conference. Everybody went. All presidents in Africa, 53 went for FOCAC 2018. Why? Because China has what we need. They have goods, they are building infrastructure projects, but China also needs what we have. They have products they need to sell, they need markets. We have a lot of people who need to buy things. So that's China for you. Now, very interesting difference between China and the Western world. The Western world needs places to invest its capital. So a lot of their money in Africa is FDI. But China spends more in trade than FDI because China needs markets as well as raw materials. So there you have it. China showing us that they are more focused in trade. Then look at it. After 2018, next year, August 2019, Japan hosts this conference. But Japan is not as powerful as China. They are about 1/3 of China's GDP. How many African leaders go? 27. So you see, money talks. So 53 African countries were in China. 27 went to Japan. China was investing $60 billion in Africa. Japan was investing $20 billion. Clearly, they are not the same. The focus is not the same, right? Now, Russia has an interesting conference. In October that same year, Russia held a conference. They were predominantly dealing with Africa in supply of arms. So you'd notice that the conference was opened in October by El Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian president, and of course his friend from Russia, Putin. 50 African leaders went, but most of the discussions were about military cooperation and arms, because Russia still manufactures great arms. And then, of course, the UK. Last week, the president was in the UK. Why did he go? Britain needs Africa. Only 21 leaders went, by the way. Only 21 leaders went. How many went for China? 53. Britain had only 21. Britain said they would invest 39 billion. They would have invested 39 billion for a while in some African markets. Now, the reason Britain is courting Africa aggressively is because of Brexit. Now, by leaving the UK, by leaving the EU, London may lose its place as the world's financial center. In fact, some analysts estimate that Britain may lose up to $770 billion of capital by leaving Brexit on the 31st of January. So they need new people, they need new friends. So who are the new friends? I'll show you who the new friends are. African leaders. And 21 of them went for the program. Britain released a list of projects it was funding in Africa as part of the project of the UK Africa Investment Summit. Now, we'll walk you through that news item and show you some of the companies listed there. It's very interesting to note that this $326 million worth of projects Ghana is getting, all the companies mentioned are British companies. So in a sense, the summit is an opportunity to create business for British companies. If you go through the list as you scroll down the story, you will notice that they are providing stadiums, they are building roads, they are building hospital beds. What is missing in this story is that after a summit like this, there is no African company mentioned. Of all the 30-something companies and businesses mentioned there, there's no Blue Skies, there's no Zoom Lion, there's no IT consortium. So the question is, what is the real benefit of these conferences? It's good to get investment, but this is not transformational. So our argument tonight is that if Africa wants to develop, world summits inviting African leaders to attend will not cut it. What we need is a partnership of equals, in a sense that whereas British come and build roads, Chinese come and build bridges, we would also have markets for our companies, our Blue Skies, our Olams. They would also be listed as benefiting from these projects. Now, these are some of the questions that were bothering my mind as I sat down with my guest. When I come back, I'll tell you who my guest is and why I spoke to her. Stay with us.
For the highlights of the top stories from the newspapers and the in-depth discussions of the news, What the Papers Are Saying, your weekly newsstand show, which sums up the big stories from reliable newspapers and news websites.
It is the appropriateness of the act and the timeliness of the act which people find as not priority. That people think that there are more pressing issues that will need the attention of leadership. And because of that, renaming of institutions is the last thing people want to wake up to.
Join Vivian Kailoko and her panel to review the headlines, break down the stories, and analyze the issues. What the Papers Are Saying is this and every Thursday at 9 p.m. on City TV.
Welcome back to The Point of View. So we started off by telling you why Africa is now the toast of world powers and why our leaders need to not just go for those conferences thinking that investing in Africa will change the continent. They have to also send our businesses there to also gain access to markets. These are some of the issues I raised with Valerie Amos. Who is Valerie Amos? So she's the first black woman to serve as a cabinet minister in the UK. She's an amazing diplomat and politician, a Labour politician. She's a life peer, leader of the House of Lords. She was a former Secretary for International Development in the UK. That's essentially the secretary that deals with DFID and some of the aid wings of the UK. We spoke about Ghana Beyond Aid. Former British High Commissioner to Australia. She served as UN Under Secretary General for 5 years. And of course, on the academic side, a former director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and first ever black head of Oxford College. She was appointed in 2020. She takes the post. She was brought to Ghana by a university, Mount Crest, to do educational partnerships. I caught up with her and asked her questions about aid, development, the scramble for Africa, and what we need to do to take advantage of the goodwill we face in the world. So the rest of the show, hear Baroness Valerie Amos speak about these issues. So welcome to the segment where we talk to people who have nice and interesting ideas that help shape our world. My guest is Baroness Valerie Amos, who is a very interesting lady. She is the first woman to serve as minister in the British cabinet and in the House of Lords. We're privileged to have her in Ghana on an educational visit where, as part of her work at SOAS, University of London, in partnership with a university in Ghana, they're trying to help produce quality education. We'll ask her her views, not just about education, but also about international development. Don't forget, she served as a UK ambassador to Australia for a few years, and she also worked at the UN. This is the era of Ghana Beyond Aid, so we'll pick her views on some of those issues. Baroness, it's great to have you on City TV.
Thank you, and it's always wonderful to be back in Ghana. Especially
a year after the year of return, or a few months after the year of return. How does that feel to be in Ghana in this season of return?
So I think it feels very special in terms of the season of return, but I have always enjoyed coming to Ghana. It's a country that I feel a particular affinity with, and I feel that I have walked with Ghana through some quite tricky political times. So I was here when President Kufuor, for example, won his first term. I was here leading the Commonwealth Observer Mission at the end of President Kufuor's term, when the government then lost the election. I think a pivotal moment for Ghana, because we had a peaceful transition from one democratic government to another. So Ghana has really led the way in terms of many African democratic societies, in terms of how it's dealt with those elections, and really using the ballot box to bring about change when people are concerned about what their government is doing. So I do feel that I have walked a particular road. When I was in development, I was there when Ghana made the decision to go for HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. There was a huge national debate about whether or not that should happen. There were many in President Kufuor's cabinet that did not want to see it happen. I was one of the people with Claire Short that spoke to him and said, you know, this is important for Ghana going forward in terms of a springboard to economic development. And we promised that if Ghana went for it, we would ensure that Britain was one of the first in terms of making sure that that debt didn't have to be repaid. So he was very brave. The government made that decision. It made a huge difference, and we stuck to our promise.
You must be happy then that Ghana has declared this season beyond aid, because it appears the fruits of HIPC have sort of come around, because now the discussion is we don't want to depend on foreign partners for aid. We want to be economically. How do you see that transition from a HIPC country in the early 2000s and end of 2019, 2020, Ghana beyond aid?
For me, it's very, very important that countries on the African continent are able to demonstrate economic growth. But more than that, are then able to use that growth as a springboard for what's being called inclusive growth, so that you're able to bring the population with you in terms of people being able to get decent jobs, being able to get decent housing, investment in areas like health and education. I was quite shocked last week in advance of Davos when Oxfam, you know, one of the international charities based in the UK, brought out a report which showed that it was the unpaid and underpaid work, particularly of women, that contributed significantly to growth in developing countries, not necessarily the investment made by, for example, billionaires across the world. I think that says a lot about what the focus needs to be of governments like the government of Ghana and of other developing countries, other countries on the African continent. So yes, growth is important, and putting in place the mechanisms to ensure infrastructure development, for example, investment in education, very important, and you would expect me to say so, but very important anyway if you look at the data, investment in health, but also creating those jobs, because you have such a big part of the economy that is dependent on jobs in the informal sector, creating those jobs in the formal sector, people contributing to the tax take so that the government is able to improve the amount that it can put into those social sectors. It becomes a kind of cycle. And I am very aware that so many people will leave countries on the continent. So I'm very conscious that people in Ghana, in other countries on the continent will migrate because they can use their skill or their labor and get more money for it, which they can send back to the country. And we need to break that cycle.
So it's true that Ghana has grown. Our economy has done very well. In 2011, we're the world's fastest grower. We've had a lot of oil, and the extractives have helped. But there are reports that show that inequality is increased. In fact, in today's Business and Financial Times, the report said 3 out of 4 Ghanaian poor kids face something they call multi-dimensional poverty. How do we address these inequality issues in an era of Ghana beyond aid, particularly when some people construe aid to mean all kinds of aid? I know you are an expert in this aid conversation. When we say a country is going beyond aid, should that be just budgetary support, or should it also include the NGO type aid and the kind of relief aid that countries in emergency face? So just talk to me a bit about that.
Well, it absolutely depends on the country and the stage of development. But let me just pick up on your first point about inequality widening in Ghana. It's widening in many countries across the world, including in the UK. I was part of a government where we worked really hard to narrow those inequalities, and we particularly focused on children and children being able to be in families that could look after them and look after them economically being the first part of all of that. So we have something which is happening which we have to really understand, which is even as countries are able to bring people who are right at the bottom up economically, you can also see growing equality between the people at the top and the bottom. So it's important that the country understands why that is happening. It's not just a phenomenon that's happening here in Ghana. I also think that you have to be very, very careful when you're a country that is strong in terms of extractive industries, because we've seen across the world what that can mean in a country where it can fuel high levels of corruption. So a government has to be very, very careful about that. And the government just has, I think, to be very clear about where it wants to spend its money. So what does that mean in terms of the let's get rid of aid? I think that you have to have a plan over a period of time. Of course, budget support can be the beginning of that, which is you don't want your budget and the annual amount that you spend as a country to be dependent on huge amounts of aid coming in. But it may be that you want to inject growth into particular sectors, and you work with donors to help to do that. It may be infrastructure, it may be kick-starting in terms of tertiary and higher levels of education. We know that in the past there's been a real focus on getting young people into primary school and then secondary education, and not so much of a focus on a university or tertiary level of education. Maybe there might be a case in a country for working with partners, including development partners, to kickstart that area. So it depends on the country, it depends on the analysis that has been made of the challenges and the plan that the government has in the longer term to wean itself off development assistance.
Just a final point on development. In this country, some people feel the idea of this going sort of reducing aid and moving to investment. So for example, President of Ghana and UK Prime Minister talk about from aid to trade. Some cynics say it's actually because in the Western world there's donor fatigue, and there's also this dissatisfaction in fringe communities which are seeing the rise of populism, and because even Brexit, they say that, look, Western governments don't have too much money and they don't have the political space to keep doling out money to poorer countries. So it's not really Ghana that wants to go beyond aid. It's because there isn't any money to give anymore. I mean, for somebody who's worked as International Development Secretary for UK, which means DFID, and all the work you do, is there a certain sense in which this is also coming from the West? It's not just a Ghanaian government saying, I want to go beyond aid?
All those things are factors right now. We've seen the rise of populism across the world, which is having an impact on the way that countries and peoples relate to each other. That does not take away from the reality of a government wanting to say to its people, we want to be independent of this. So both things can happen. And with respect to the amount of money going into development assistance, yes, there's huge pressure on those budgets across the world. And that is partly fueled by this rise in populism that you have talked about. But in Britain, we still have that 0.7% commitment in terms of our development aid. It's in our legislation. I am not saying that there's not a huge pressure. There are some of our populist newspapers, there are some who are very active in our intellectual community who are pushing on this agenda. But so far, the commitment to that 0.7 has remained. And there's been a move towards really thinking about value for money. What does this mean? It's a lot of money. And this also links to our trade agenda. Things are changing. Brexit will undoubtedly have an impact. But remember, the relationship that Britain has with the majority of African countries is already covered by an agreement. So we're not going to be renegotiating trade deals with African countries over the next 12 months. That will come over a much longer time frame. And my hope, given what we have seen in terms of the kinds of trade deals that have been done with China, for example, given what some have described as the new scramble for Africa, because you have these summits with, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Japan, China, Britain, everyone wanting to forge those relationships with African leaders and their governments going forward. My strong hope is that those countries themselves will be strong negotiators, will be thinking about what is best for their country, that we have transparency in the way these negotiations are conducted, so that the people of the country can see what's been negotiated and why.
But there's a sense in which Africa is always at a disadvantage because these are 52 economies, disparate. So you mentioned FOCAC, TICAD, and all these conferences where African presidents go to meet one. But even within the sub-region, it's very difficult for ECOWAS, for example, to get a single currency. Trade within continent is very small. Some people, from the economic point of view, feel African countries need to focus more on their regional trade blocks, get that functioning. Then they can be in a better position to negotiate, because then it's almost like 1884 all over again, 1844 all over again, where we're just splitting the continent. What are your thoughts on the best way to accelerate the continent's development in the face of this so-called new scramble for Africa?
So I don't think that I am best placed to say how this should be conducted, but I do have a couple of reflections on this. I think the African Free Trade Agreement is an important aspect of this. I also think strengthening those regional trade blocs, and I've watched over many, many years the challenges that there have been in relation to that. I think strengthening those regional trade blocs is also important. And really thinking about, is this about forms of economic partnership that are important, or does it go beyond that? Part of what we've seen, for example, in the European Union is that as the debate has become more about strengthening the relationships across the European Union, going beyond that economic, but into other areas, bringing your currency together and so on, it creates tensions. So I think it's important for those regional blocs on the African continent to learn from the mistakes of others, but also to be clear about what they would like to achieve through SADC, ECOWAS, and the other regional groupings that exist on the continent. I don't buy that African countries and their governments don't have a lot of power in these relationships. I understand the history of colonialism, what that has done to the continent. That is an absolute reality that we have to deal with. But given the resources on this continent, there is a huge amount of power that can be harnessed to ensure that the negotiations going forward in terms of trade deals are more advantageous to the continent than they are right now, some of them.
Let's talk briefly about Britain's place in the world before we come to education and the other issues. So again, using the conferences, so there was a British newspaper commenting and said, for the Africa Investment Summit, less than 20 heads of state came. FOCAC had over 42. TICAD had more than 30. Even the Russians had a lot more. Some people feel Britain has left its dalliance with Africa, has allowed it to deteriorate, and therefore we had, in fact, they even say, if you look at your number of development secretaries, your secretaries, ministers for Africa have been changed too frequently. So you haven't prioritized Africa that much, and you're sort of been left behind. And others have come in, and African countries have formed stronger relationships because, again, we are in a similar state of development with the Chinese than we have the British. What's your comment on that? And some people feel the Commonwealth may probably be the channel through which UK regains its, status. What are your thoughts about that whole conversation?
Power relationships have changed across the world and have been changing, as we have seen over the last few years. So in that sense, and of course there's the Commonwealth as you mentioned, so in that sense there are many routes and connections through which Britain has a relationship to those countries. But our power is, in my view, decreasing. That's a reality of those changing economic and political relationships. It is also, my view, a consequence of what's been happening in Britain over the last 3 years, where we have been very internally focused as a result of the referendum vote to leave the European Union, and the world has moved on while we have been engaged in what I've called our own, local difficulty. It has really had an impact. We have been seen as turning away from the world, even as the government has coined this phrase of global Britain. I think whilst the Commonwealth and the relationships between Commonwealth countries remain important, that is not the mechanism through which countries have engaged in their trade or even their political relationships with Britain. So the Commonwealth may well have a role to play going forward, but I think it will have to be very clear what that role is. If you look at Commonwealth countries across the piece, they are on the whole, the Commonwealth is on the whole dominated by countries with a very young population. So the kinds of issues which concern young people, including climate change, wanting to have a meaningful relationship with other young people across the world, wanting to get a decent education, wanting to have a decent job, these are things that challenge a number of Commonwealth countries going forward. So there is an agenda there, but it is not necessarily a trade related agenda. So where the Commonwealth wants to sit in relation to that, I think is something which still has to be sorted out in the context of where Britain sits post the Brexit discussions.
There are some people who say Brexit and Trump and all these things are a reflection of the fact that liberal democracy has failed. It hasn't delivered the goods. Inequality has increased. And
I've argued that myself.
Yes. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, that we should be humble enough to admit that, yes, there were positives with liberal democracy, but we've gotten to a point where the needs we face today, we need a new iteration of the type of democracy we run. What are your thoughts?
Well, if I just look at Britain, which is in a way the country that I know best, there were large parts of the United Kingdom where over time people began to feel that their governments didn't really appreciate and understand the challenges that they were facing, didn't come up with the solutions to help and support them. And I think it is not surprising that people then started to look around to think, well, who is to blame for this? And people came up with a lot of different answers to that question, but principally they blamed their governments. And I think we didn't sufficiently appreciate that some of the enormous strides that we had made and the difference that we had made in our countries were not consolidated enough and strong enough, and that the economic benefits of, for example, globalization, but also the challenges that came with that weren't being addressed fast enough.
Let's talk about education. So it was interesting to learn you were a head girl in your school.
Deputy
head girl. We wouldn't take that honor from the head girl herself. Got to the UK, studied at Warwick, Birmingham. I mean, you are a role model for many on this continent. First black minister in the government, the House of Lords.
First black woman cabinet
minister, yes. So that's, I'm sure you would say education had a role to play in your rise. Is education still the leveler as it was in your day? If somebody is born poor in Ghana or a village in Guyana, will education be as powerful for them today as it was for you at the time?
Education is incredibly important, and it was a kind of mantra in the household that I grew up in. My parents both started out as teachers, and both felt very strongly that if you had a good education, it gave you a platform, a springboard from which you could progress. And I still think that that is the case. It is not the only thing that matters. There are other things about, where someone is brought up, the kinds of opportunities that they have to develop a whole range of soft skills that really matter. I see it in the UK, where you will have young people who academically you cannot fault them at all, but they have come from backgrounds where their parents have not necessarily been able to help them. They don't have the right kinds of contacts. They may not necessarily have grown up in a household where there have been a lot of books, all kinds of soft skills that we take for granted if we've managed to come through that education system ourselves and get a decent job. And one of the things we're very much wanting to do at SOAS, and the partnership that I'm here to launch between SOAS and Mount Crest University, is about building that capability, building that capacity, knowing in terms of SOAS we have very strong values in terms of our global connectivity and wanting to partner with countries on this continent but in other parts of the world. But we want that partnership to be one which is an equal partnership. It's not something that we want to exploit. We don't think that everybody should have to come to London to get a decent education. It's a very expensive way to be educated, and we have seen and been concerned about the way the numbers have fallen of young people coming from the African continent to study at SOAS. So we're very keen to enter into partnerships which widen the base of
So you're bringing SOAS to Accra.
Well, we are partnering with a university that will enable us to get benefits from both sides of that partnership. Mount Crest are building a new campus. Part of what we will be doing is building the capacity of Mount Crest faculty to teach various things so they can then offer a wider range of opportunities to their students. But we will also have faculty flying in to teach students on the Mount Crest campus. We're starting with law. We see this as a long-term partnership over time. At SOAS, we have the A in the name, the School of Oriental and African Studies. It started as the School of Oriental Studies. Africa was added 20 years later to reflect the research, the teaching. We started as a place that taught a number of African languages. So to reflect that shift, Africa was added to the SOAS name. We don't want that to disappear. And we are looking at ways, a range of ways, not just through partnerships, that we can consolidate that strong history that we have, that strong commitment we have to this continent. If you look across the continent historically, so many people who ended up in academia, not just here in Ghana but elsewhere, came through SOAS. We have a previous president of Ghana who's an alum of SOAS. Sadly, he has passed, John Atta Mills.
Yes.
The present Speaker of Parliament. I mean, there are many people that we can point to, but not just in Ghana, elsewhere on the continent. We don't want to lose that connectivity, that strong connection that we have with this continent. You have to continue to refresh and reform, and that's what we're doing.
It would appear this is a strategy that other universities have also.
Yes.
So it seems as if in future we're going to have more of those partnerships, because I know not just British but American universities as well that have set up campuses here, and they're educating more people. That seems to be the way to go. But let me take you back to basic and secondary, because one of our challenges is access. And the flagship policy of this government is something it calls free secondary education. Some people have seen that as an either or, that if you increase access, you dumping down quality at the same time. So really they think that the question is, how do you improve access and not bring down quality? Any ideas about how to do this? Because it's a major conversation in Ghana.
Yes, and I'm not surprised it's a major conversation, because it's a very hard thing to do. Because as soon as you say that primary or secondary education is free, so many people who have not been able to send their children consistently to school are delighted by it and send their children. But if you haven't planned properly, if you haven't thought about how many schools do you need, how many classrooms do you need, how much money do you need for the resources that you're going to put into those classrooms, how are you going to get quality teachers, this means salaries, houses and so on, how are you going to get quality teachers going to rural areas? There are a whole range of things that a government has to think about to help to deliver quality in terms of free education. It doesn't happen overnight, and there will be a huge amount of disappointment that people will have. I mean, I remember when Kenya announced free primary education many, many years ago, going to Kenya and visiting some of those schools in rural areas, and you would have one teacher with a classroom where there weren't enough desks, there weren't enough chairs, where children were having to share exercise books. There was so much positivity about having the access to the education, but then there were these other things that needed to be dealt with as well. You can either plan for everything, recognize that it requires a huge injection of resources and wait for a long time to do it, or you can start recognizing the challenges that you are going to face and over time work it through. There's no right answer.
There's no silver bullet.
There's no right answer.
All right.
People will be frustrated whichever way you do it, but it is really important to think through and have a plan that takes you to that point where you are able to provide quality education for all the young people who need it and want it.
Okay, this is CCTV. We're having a chat with Baroness Valerie Amos, and we're discussing a wide range of things. She's in Ghana on the invitation of the Mount Crest University. They have a partnership with SOAS, and it's going to bring some new programs. We're talking international development aid, education. Let's end by coming to something I know you're a champion of, BAME in the UK. And I think in Ghana, our major disadvantaged group are women and young people. So let's talk about women. We have an election in 2020, December. Less than 30% of our members of parliament are women. The way politics is done, it's even difficult for them to hold themselves out for position. I mean, what are your thoughts on how we can change that playing field? Because there are just too few women, and that really, I don't know, half of the population doesn't get to be part of the conversation, right? So what are your ideas about how we implement that in politics? I'll come to business later, but in politics first.
So there are a range of things that you can look at, and there are very few countries that have got to parity. So let's admit that at the outset. Some countries do it by making sure that there is a quota. There are a lot of people who don't like that, including women, because they feel that they are being advantaged in a particular kind of way. I don't agree with that, because if you're starting out with a field that's not level, you have very good women that don't have any chance of getting through because of the discrimination that exists in the wider society. So I think we have to overcome that. But I understand the concerns that some women have about being pointed out as special and not good enough. And that can work in a very, very negative way. I think the political culture has to change. We've got a horrible, toxic culture in the UK right now, for example, where a number of women parliamentarians, not just women parliamentarians, but the kind of abuse that women parliamentarians have faced online for a whole variety of things, the kind of threats that they have faced. We saw one MP, Jo Cox, who was killed as a result of her views in relation to arguing that Britain should remain in the European Union and what happened to her. And the kind of violence that is talked about online has been terrible in years. So, and this is being replicated in many countries across the world. So really calling out that culture and finding a way to deal with this in relation to social media is important. Also, supporting women so that they're able to make their case, not be shouted down. I've seen it so many times when women have tried to talk about issues that, for example, men are not necessarily interested in, the way that has had an impact. So there are a range of strategies that have to be looked at.
But you certainly believe in affirmative action.
I do. I believe in recognizing that the playing field is not level, and we have to do something about it. I'm a member of the Labour Party. We're going through a leadership race right now. We've never had a woman leader in the Labour Party. We've had women as temporary leaders. We've never had a woman leader. We have 3 women right now and a man in that race. And
you think it's your turn? This is a woman's turn.
I don't believe in turns in that.
Or is it your time?
In that
not
respect.
time.
In terms of time,
this is our time.
It's not about this is our time. It's been our time for a long time. This is about women are more than 50% of the population of the world.
But people are aware. People are informed.
It's not about this is our. It's about recognizing that there are talented women out there who can do this, and there have been for many, many years. Yes, there is a greater recognition today, and I hope that means that there will be some change. But let's not be complacent about this. This is a continued battle, fight, and we cannot think that it's over. The minute, and I've seen this, the minute we think, we've done it and we can turn our attention to something else, we slip back. And that worries me, because it means that the underlying cultural issues and challenges we have still remain.
Finally, on business, Ghana has the 2nd largest proportion of women entrepreneurs after Uganda. But that actually belies a bigger economic disadvantage. So whereas a lot of women own their own businesses, they don't get access to loans,
access to finance,
they don't get access to office space. So it's very, very difficult. How do we leverage this fantastic statistic that a lot of women own their own businesses, a lot of them are selling, to now use that as a tool to empower women economically?
So one example is the banks have got to be challenged in terms of their lending practices. Why is it that women entrepreneurs who are successful are not getting the same access to the loan book as others? So what is it about the way that they look at the programs and the projects that gets them to that decision? Is it because the people making the decisions are predominantly men? Is it about the kinds of questions that they ask? Is it because there isn't recognition that the kinds of businesses that some women are engaged in are as productive and profitable as others? There are a whole range of questions to be asked, and that's just one aspect of it in relation to the loans that the banks are making.
Let's end on a lighter note. So each time I travel outside Africa and I say I'm from Ghana, people say, did you say Guyana or Ghana? So there's always that.
It's confused all the time, isn't it?
Yeah. And I've met a Guyanese journalist who says some of the food they eat is very similar to Ghana.
Absolutely.
They eat plantain and stuff. So my question is, this
fufu?
Oh, you do fufu too?
Of course.
I see. You do ampesi or yam with.
We do, yeah.
Brilliant. This is the year after the year of return. What opportunity do you suppose a country like Ghana has in leveraging that in terms of some sort of cultural tourism, and what demand is there in the diaspora to come to a place like Ghana? Because you understand the UK, you understand the Caribbean better than most. If we said to them, look, Ghana is doing a re-enactment, whatever, would they be interested in coming? And what should we do to get them to reconnect? Because we feel this is actually where they're from.
So a country like Ghana and a country like Guyana have always, I think, had very strong links. And there are Guyanese who have always looked back to their roots. But I think we also have to recognize that the legacy of colonialism and divide and rule has played its part. So there has been a lot in the Caribbean historically over the years about Africa and its development, which has been extremely negative. The same exists in the UK, both in terms of countries on the African continent and the Caribbean. I've seen Stormzy talk about this, for example, growing up in London and the kids from the Caribbean not relating in the classroom or indeed in the playground to kids with African heritage. So part of this is a better understanding of the history and the connectivity. And we are very, very bad at this because the narrative is told by somebody else.
Yes.
We have to tell our own narrative. We have to challenge that history of colonialism and the story that is told about that. And we have to talk about our own heroines and our own heroes. That is a place to start, and then we take it forward. I think your point about tourism, of course there is an opportunity there. I think it needs to be more than cultural tourism. I remember being here, going with my family to Elmina for the first time, and the impact that had. It wasn't my first visit, but it was the first visit for my parents and for others in my family. And the impact that had, but also opening our eyes immediately to that connection. So culture is important, but the history, in my view, is even more important.
Brilliant. We have to tell our own story, and we have to build our own society. Thank you, Baroness Valerie Amos.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. And that's all we have time for on this edition of the show. Stay with City TV. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on City TV's YouTube channel. Subscribe for more videos on The Point of View. My name is Bernard Avile. Thank you.
The Point of View with Bernard Avile, Monday and Wednesday nights, only on City TV.